Hi, everybody. I'm back in Korea now, but I can't come into school until I get my negative COVID test. That should be sometime today, so I'll be in after today. We're going to start a new unit today. It is on the biosphere, and we're going to start by talking about what we call terrestrial biomes. And I'm just going to ask you to learn through screencasts and then do an assignment just like we would in a normal day, except without me there. Okay, let's get on it. So, first of all, a big focus of this unit is on the concept of ecology. And ecology is just basically how it is that the organisms on our planet, which includes you and me, interact with both each other and with what we call the abiotic or the physical aspects of our environment. So those physical environments are going to break into two different things. We're going to talk about abiotic factors and biotic factors. So an abiotic factor simply means the non-living aspects of our environment. So it's the things that influence organisms that aren't living things. So that's things like the temperature, water, uh, humidity, soil, nutrients, how much sunlight, things like that. Biotic factors are the living aspects of the environment. So it's those other organisms that you have to interact with on a daily basis, and they often influence each other. So you have predators and you have prey, you have herbivores and you have plants, you have dead organisms, and then decomposers that return their waste products to the soil. So those are what we mean by biotic factors. Now, when we go to look at the different levels of structure we can have in ecology, we can start with the individual. You are an individual. Your dog or cat is an individual. Population would be all of the members of a particular species. So, like all the humans or all the dogs that live in a given defined area of the planet. Now, a community is all the populations of all the species that share the same area. So, all um, the frogs and birds and plants and mammals and snakes that occupy a given patch of forest, that would be a community of that forest. An ecosystem is the community that lives in an area plus all the abiotic factors that influence it. So that also has to do with the amount of nutrients and sunlight and everything else. And then a biome is simply a collection of ecosystems that are similar enough in characteristic that we want to group them and say, well, you know what, we can divide the world into a certain number of biomes. And that's what today's lesson is. Biomes are basically similar ecosystems, similar enough that we want to group them and just talk about them in a plural. So we can divide the world into a number of biomes, and depending on the search source you look at, you're going to see all kinds of different numbers. I'm going to try to keep it simple for you, just sort of make the point here. But basically, a biome, as I said, is a group of related ecosystems. They usually are defined by the dominant plant species, and that in turn is usually determined by the temperature and precipitation that's present. Those two things have everything to do with the biotic factors that will be there, and that in turn influences things like soil fertility and things like that. So here's a map of the biomes of the world, and we're just going to divide them into the following ones. And the thing is, biomes are to some extent, to a pretty significant extent, latitudinally arranged because temperature and precipitation tend to be latitudinally arranged. So what we find is in the very northern, well, in the very north and very south extremes, we have sort of a fairly lifeless area. Biomes are usually defined by the plant species that exist, and there's no plants in the glacial north and south. So in Greenland and Antarctica, it's just ice. It's not really a biome. Okay, but then just below that, uh, just south of that, in the northern hemisphere, we have an area called the tundra. Below the tundra, we have this band of conifer forests that we call taiga. Below that, we have the temperate seasonal forests, which are what we have here in Korea and in Japan. We have tropical rainforests, which are located pretty much at the equator. We have temperate grassland, which is found in places that are at high and low latitudes, but there's not a lot of moisture. We have savanna, which is essentially tropical grasslands, which are also located in similar places to grasslands. And then we have deserts. And deserts, as we said before, are mostly at 30 degrees north and south of the equator, and also in places where we have rain shadows, right? But those are the biomes we're going to look at. So we're going to take each of them in turn. We're going to learn how to analyze them in terms of temperature and precipitation, and then you're going to practice. I don't expect you to memorize these. You do not have to memorize biomes, but you do have to know how to analyze the abiotic data and try to make a determination as to what biome we're dealing with. So, biomes are generally determined, or named at least, or I'd say defined by the dominant plant communities that are present. And that in turn is determined by how much light there is, how much moisture mostly, and how much temperature you have. And so, for that reason, we can often correlate biomes to latitudes, as I said. Now, here's an interesting graph. All right, so in this one here, it points out that uh, temperature and moisture are very, or I should say, temperature and precipitation are the main determinants of what biomes exist. Now, this, as I said, there's different biomes that are listed in different sources. This one has a few more than what we talked about, but here you go. Look at this. If we have a small amount of annual precipitation, what we find is we tend to have things like tundra, grassland, desert, and savanna. And as the amount of annual rainfall goes up, we start getting into forests and then rainforests. Then, if we throw in temperature, what we find is when it's cold, you can't have productivity. You can't have plants growing when it's below freezing for a big part of the year. So, we find is that as we go this way, we get more and more productivity until we get to these rainforests over here. So productivity is a term I've been using. Let's define it a little bit. Productivity is simply a measure of the amount of plant matter that grows in a given area of land, say a hectare of land. It could be a square meter, whatever you want. All right, that's what we mean by productivity. And it's everything when we talk about ecology, because that is the food that the whole ecosystem is going to depend on. Plants capture sunlight energy, turn it into food. We call that productivity. And then all other organisms are dependent on that amount of food. So when productivity is high, you can have a lot of organisms. So basically, productivity is mostly determined by rainfall. If you have a plant in your house, a live plant, if you don't water it, it dies. That's my problem. My wife and I always forget to water our plants. Water is the main determinant. More water, more productivity. However, temperature also matters because if the temperature gets below freezing, then plants can't undergo photosynthesis. And so the plants are adapted to basically go dormant during those time periods. So when they're dormant, they're not undergoing photosynthesis, so there's no productivity. So we find low temperatures are associated with low productivity. And finally, it's really important to point out for this unit that in particular that productivity is directly related to biodiversity. Biodiversity is basically how many species exist in an area. And what we find is the more productivity there is, the more biodiversity you have, the more organisms, the more different kinds of species that you can have. So tropical rainforests have very high productivity, they have very high biodiversity. Deserts have very little rainfall, so they have very low um, productivity and have very low biodiversity. Okay, so let's just look at the rainfall and then temperature requirements. So basically, rainfall is everything. So if I get less than 25, and don't worry, you don't have to memorize this, okay? You have a chart. But if I get less than 25 centimeters, I'm talking about a desert. Or a lot of times, unfortunately, we list this in terms of millimeters. That'd be 250 millimeters. For a grassland, it's just above that. If I get a little bit more rain than that, then I can support grasses and some shrubs. So if I get 25 to 80 centimeters a year, I can have things other than cactuses. When down here in the desert, the only things that can grow are things that can store water, cacti and succulent plants. But when I get above 25 centimeters, now there's enough water that grasses can start to grow. If I get more than 80, then I can start growing trees, and I can get what we call a seasonal forest. And that just means that there's times in the year where it's very productive, and there's times of year where it's not very productive, because often rainfall comes and goes with the seasons. And then when I get to a rainforest, there's just so much rain, more than 160 centimeters. That's 1.5 meters plus, up to 10 meters of rain a year. When you have that much rain, you can support an awful lot of productivity. Now, the general temperature ranges are important too, because as I said, if it gets too cold, if it gets below freezing, there's no productivity. So what we find is in the tundra, very low productivity. Why? Because most of the year is below zero. Most of the year it's just freezing cold. You can't have anything growing. So there's no trees there. The taiga, which is the conifer forest, the evergreen trees, pine trees, generally we're talking about maybe about half the year the temperature is below freezing, about half the year it's above. And when it gets above, it can get quite warm, but when it gets below freezing, about half the year. Then temperate biomes, like temperate seasonal forests or temperate grasslands, basically you have quite a bit of seasonal temperature variation, and it gets either close to or even maybe below for a short period below zero, but most of the year it's going to be above zero. and it may get down close to it, but definitely gets into the single digits. Okay. And then we have tropical environments. And tropical environments, it never gets anywhere close to single digits. It might get down to 15 degrees. That's about it. Okay. And so let's just go. Oh, okay. So I think I touched something by accident. Here we go. All right. One of the main skills I expect you to develop is your ability to interpret climate graphs. Now, a climate graph always has these components. The x-axis is the months of the year from January through December, month 1 through month 12, always. Okay. And then it presents basically a bar chart and a line graph simultaneously. The bar chart is going to be precipitation, and the line. So these blue bars you see here, that's how much precipitation, and then the line graph is going to be the temperature, the average temperature for each month, and the bar graph is the average amount of rainfall for each. Well, I should say precipitation for each month. So this is the climate graph for Seoul. So what you see is the temperature. We have pretty significant temperature extremes. Right, it gets up to an average above 25 in the summer months, and it actually drops below zero for about 2.5 months a year, which you might have noticed if you lived here. Right, that makes us a temperate environment. Uh, and if we look up how much rainfall, if we add up all the rainfall over the course of the year, we're going to see we have basically uh, what is it, like 126 centimeters, which puts us smack in the middle of temperate forest biome, which is great because it's going to be fall soon and all the leaves are about to fall off the trees. And I love that time of year when all the leaves turn red. All right, now let's just go through each of the biomes in turn, just talk about them. No, you don't have to memorize them. In a test, you get like a chart of all this, but I just want to walk you through this. Okay, so let's just start at the top and work our way down. Tundra. Tundra is located in the very northern extremes. There's no southern equivalent because Antarctica is just all ice. Now, what is tundra? Well, it's this cold, treeless area where the plants are the dominating plants are like mosses and lichens, and maybe some grasses, but that's it. Uh, and as I said, they're located in the far north. If I look at a climate graph for a tundra biome. Well, notice, and by the way, I should have said this before. With these climate graphs, usually the right axis is temperature, and the left vertical axis is precipitation. Not always, but usually the one on the left is precipitation, and the one on the right is temperature, and the bottom is always months of the year. So if I look here, what I notice is that the temperature, here's the temperature of zero. My goodness, most of the year is below zero. Only a few months are above zero. That makes it a tundra. The other thing to notice is that if we add all this up, like 4.5 centimeters, 4 centimeters, 4 centimeters. If I add all that up, I get very little precipitation. It's too cold to get much moisture in the air. All right, so let's talk about abiotic and biotic factors. The abiotic factors associated with the tundra is, first of all, low temperature, below freezing for most of the year. Well, one consequence of that is that when water, during the warmer parts of the year, when water does infiltrate, it freezes. And we get this layer of frozen soil called permafrost. That is the main defining characteristic in abiotic terms for this biome. And that prevents trees from growing roots. So there's no trees possible here. It doesn't precipitate much. It's basically it's a desert, and the sunlight is always very weak and low in the sky. Now, the biotic factors we associate with is like what life is there. All right, first of all, low productivity. There's a short growing season, not a lot of plants, so there's not going to be much biodiversity since there's not much productivity. Very short growing season. Uh, and because of this, most of the animals that live there have to either hibernate in the winter or get the heck out of there by migrating away. Let's talk about the taiga. Taiga is sometimes called boreal forest, okay, or it basically is conifer forest, evergreen forest. Basically it's Siberia and Canada, okay. That's basically what it amounts to, all right. Uh, and these are found just below the tundra, and sometimes called boreal forest. Well, what's the difference between tundra and taiga? Well, the main difference is the amount of time in the year that is below freezing. Whereas in the tundra, it's below freezing most of the year. In the taiga, is below freezing half or a little bit less than half a year. So you have more than half a year usually that's above freezing. And because of that, there's no permafrost. It does melt. And since there's no permafrost, trees can grow their roots down there. So we get these big forests. This is actually the largest biome on the planet in terms of the area of the planet. It's got a little bit more precipitation and enough to support trees. And let's just look at the abiotic factors. So we've got these long, cold winters, short, hot summer, but we get more precipitation than we got in the tundra, and as a consequence, we get more productivity. One thing that's interesting here, though, is that the chemistry of these pine needles of these evergreens is such that when they fall to the ground, they tend to have a low pH, and they make the soil fairly acidic, which makes it very low in nutrients. So it's hard to farm if you're in an area that you clear out of this place. Biotic factors, again, productivity is quite limited, but not as limited as it is in the tundra. So we have moderate biodiversity instead of low biodiversity. The vegetation is mostly conifer trees, pine trees, fir trees, things like that. And we do get these large mammals. We get wolves, and we get bears, and we get moose. So it does support considerably more biodiversity than what you get in the tundra, but still fairly low compared to other biomes. So temperate seasonal forest. So when a lot of people think of forest, that's what they think of. Trees that lose their leaves in the winter. That's what we call the seasonal forest. Okay, there's sometimes they're called deciduous forests, sometimes broadleaf forest, seasonal broadleaf forest. But basically, the trees have these leaves that are so big that if snow was to fall on them, it break the limbs. So when winters come, what they do is they just let go of their leaves. That way, the limbs of the trees don't break. Whereas with the conifer trees, they have these little tiny needles, and they can undergo photosynthesis all year because there's not enough time otherwise, not enough light otherwise. So the idea is fir trees and pine trees, they can collect snow and not break. But these broadleaf trees, they couldn't do that. They can collect a lot of light, but they got to let it go in the summer months. So if we look at a climate graph, what we're going to notice is that you may or may not get months where it gets down to or below zero, but you'll definitely get some that are in the single digits. I mean, they always don't get into the single digits. The summers can get quite hot, they get 20, 30 degrees, and there's a moderate amount of precipitation. We're talking about 80 to 160 centimeters of rainfall a year. That's enough to support pretty robust tree growth. So the abiotic factors is we basically have a pretty broad temperature range where we do get two or even below zero for a month or two out of the year. That gives us a nice long growing season, and because there's is fairly long growing season and there's an abundance of water, you get pretty high productivity. You get pretty high biodiversity, and the because the leaves fall down, the soil is accumulates a lot of these nutrients. So the some of the richest, most nutrient-rich soils on the planet are found in these temperate seasonal forests. So productivity is very high. So biodiversity is high. The trees go dormant in the winter, and the decomposing leaves, as I said, make the soil very fertile. Now let's talk about temperate grasslands. Actually, you know what? We're just talking about grasslands. There's temperate grasslands, there's savannas. I'm just going to clump them together, make our lives a little bit easier. Grassland. What is a grassland? Well, grassland is basically there's this prairie area where you have grasses and shrubs, but you don't have trees. All right, you don't have exposed dirt. It's not like a desert, but you have grasses and you have bushes, but no trees. There's just not quite enough water to support trees. That makes a grassland. And so if I look at a climate graph of a grassland, what I'm going to find is I've got above 25 centimeters a year. Below that, it'd be a desert, but I'm below 80. So that means that if I add up all this, I'm not quite getting to 80. If I got to 80, I could support trees. I can't quite support trees. And the temperature can be quite varied in these. You can have ones where it stays around, tropical ones that stays around 25 all year. You have other ones where there's several months that are below freezing. So there's quite a bit of temperature variation here. The abiotic factors, the main one is fairly low precipitation, not as low as the desert, 25 to 80. You can have hot summers and cold winters. But here's the thing, the soil is very, very rich in nutrients because these plants are designed to live for just 1 year and they die. But when they die, they just return their nutrients to the soil. So these soils tend to be incredibly rich. And this is where, and there's no trees to remove. So humans have pretty much destroyed all of this grassland biomes. And there's very few grassland biomes left on our planet that humans haven't converted into to farmland because it's just so easy to plant and there's so much nutrients in the soil. The biotic factors, well, there's not a lot of productivity because there's not a lot of rain. So that means there's not a lot of biodiversity either. But what you do get is this: you have, the low precipitation limits you to grasses, and that means you can have these large herds of grazing animals because there's not a lot of trees in the way. So you can get these large herds. They make herds because That way they can, they're kind of exposed to predators, so they make herds. So if if one animal sees it and spooks, they can all be protected by that. Okay, so it's basically many eyes make them safe. But the other thing you have is these small animals, like rodent type animals, gophers and stuff like that, and they live there too. But what they do is they burrow underneath it, and that activity tends to keep the grasses well aerated, the roots well aerated, and the larger animals tend to eat the plants and then distribute the nutrients with their feces. So those are the main biotic factors associated with it. And last one, desert. Not quite last one. We have rainforest. Okay, desert. The deserts are mostly located about 30 degrees north and south of the equator, as we've said before, because of the Hadley cell circulation, where it's descending and dry. Very low precipitation means very little plant life. What plants can be there have to be succulents and cacti. The soils are the worst on the planet. They're almost not even soils. They're just basically dirt and sand. So it's very difficult to support any kind of plants with that. That's basically what makes a desert. Desert, by the way, they don't have to be hot. They just have to be dry. So if we look at a climate graph, the main thing we're going to notice is there's very little precipitation. You add it up, you're going to get less than 25 centimeters, and you usually have one or more months with no rainfall whatsoever. The temperature can get cold or it can stay constant. That's really not a factor in terms of determining what makes a desert. The main thing is the lack of precipitation. Now, abiotic factors, apart from the precipitation aspect of it, is you tend to get these very extreme day-night shifts because there's water is good at moderating temperature because it has a high specific heat capacity. But without water, the temperature can get very, very cold at night and very hot during the day. And the other thing is the soil has like almost no nutrients in it at all. So it's really difficult to get any kind of productivity out of this land because there's so few nutrients with which to support it. Biotic factors, again, productivity is going to be as the low as it gets, and that means biodiversity is going to be as low as it gets. And the plants that do live there, the only way they can survive is by storing water. So what they tend to do is they tend to hold water inside their bodies, and so you've got cactuses and succulent plants. And finally, we're going to finish off with tropical rainforest. So, tropical rainforest, they're always located near the equator. The equator is very green on this planet because that's where we have the rising Hadley air. And so, there's lots of precipitation there. And so, we get a lot of thick vegetation growing there as that rain comes down. So, we look at a climate graph of a tropical rainforest. There's no requirement that every month be rainy. You can have some months that aren't very rainy at all. But if you add up all the rain, what you're going to get is about 2 to 10 meters of rain a year. Let's say more than 160 centimeters of rain a year, up to 1,000 centimeters of rain a year. The temperature never gets below say 15 degrees. It never gets close to single digits. That's the main things about that. Abiotic factors, apart from the very high precipitation and the lack of temperature variation. Um, the soil is very low in nutrients. Ironically, you would think it'd be very high in nutrients with all these plants there. However, what happens is two things. One is anything that falls to the ground immediately gets consumed by all. They have very high biodiversity. There's lots of animals living that they're going to take up all those nutrients out of that before it gets in the soil. And what does get in the soil gets leached away by the high amount of infiltration that's happening there. So as a result, there's very, very, very poor soils. And then what we find is the sunlight is very strong in the canopy. The most light you can get is at the equator. But when you get down to the bottom, where you and I would walk around, there's very little, like 6% of light makes it to the bottom. Biotic factors we find there. Productivity is the highest on the planet because you have a lot of rain and it's really warm. And that gives you this dense vegetation that usually forms a canopy. And so most of life actually lives up, many, many meters above the ground in the canopy. Biodiversity is insanely high, and there's many, many symbiotic relationships between organisms. And we're going to learn to call these things specialist species are abound here. Okay, I know this is a long one. I'm sorry for that. Thanks for watching. Let's go ahead and see what you know. Let's get you working on reading those climate graphs and associating them with biomes.